I'm Cathleen Barnhart, and welcome to Middle Ground Book Fest 2021. I'm here with some other authors, and we are going to be talking today about our books. So I'm going to ask everyone else to introduce themselves first, and then I'm both a panelist and a moderator, so then I'll introduce myself at the end. So Lexie, will you start us off?
Sure. I'm Lexie. I use they or he pronouns, and I wrote The Ship We Built. It's noted as the first middle grade novel centering a trans boy to be written by one at a big publisher, and it follows a young trans boy in the late 1990s in Michigan, dealing with themes of incarceration, loneliness, doubt, and imagination as a tool for survival. I'll pass the baton.
I'll go. My name is Aida Salazar, and I am the author of this book. It's The Moon Within, and it's out in Spanish, La Luna Dentro de Mí. And it's about a young girl who's coming into her adolescence, and she's blossoming. Her best friend is also blossoming, but in a different way. They're discovering their gender identity, and together they have to deal with friendship and puberty and betrayal and trust and crushes. So it's all about what happens and all the hormones that start popping at that time.
Sonja?
And I'm Sonja Solter. I use she, her pronouns. And my book is When You Know What I Know. If I can get it out of the glare there, almost. And it is a middle grade novel in verse about it's about 10-year-old Tori in the aftermath of being molested by her uncle. So it's a lot about her emotional experiences and her relationships, and then her eventual journey towards healing as well.
Mm.
Thank you. And I'm Cathleen Barnhart. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the author of That's What Friends Do, which is a middle grade novel about two best friends, who's Samantha and David, whose friendship is challenged when David decides that he needs to show Samantha how he really feels for her, but it goes all wrong, and she ends up feeling attacked by her best friend. It's the story of the misunderstandings that lead to that moment, and the way these two friends have to work through to move past this moment. So I'm so excited to be here with you guys. Our four novels are all debut middle grade novels. They're all our middle grade debut novels. So I wanted to hear from each of you why this was the thing that you felt most compelled to write, or why this was the truth that you wanted to speak to middle school students. And Sonja, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so there's sort of two stories. The one story is how it felt when it was coming to me, which felt very spontaneous. And I was out in the middle of the woods with my notebook, and I had just done a picture book semester in the program I was in, so I was very into language. And so this verse poem came to me, and it was actually ended up being one of the first poems in the book, called Believe Me. And I could hear the character's voice, which is actually usually how it works for me. And so it really felt like this character wanted her story to be told and believed. And, it's the story at the beginning, that poem, of when she very first tells her mother. That's how it starts. So it felt like that, thinking afterwards and at a slightly bigger picture. I think I was also influenced by some things I'd seen over the years, articles, social media, various places, where I felt like there was people actually had a lot of trouble understanding survivors' experiences and how that could look, and can look a lot of different ways, of course. But and so I think that influenced me, and just the fact that, according to the National Center for Victims of Crime, children are most vulnerable to child sex abuse between the ages of 7 and 13. So, I didn't know that exact statistic at the time, but I had the general idea about that. And so I think that also influenced why a story came through me about that particular age, because it is unfortunately very common experience at that age.
Nice. Aida?
Well, I similarly, the voice came to me first. I was on a flight, and at the time, my daughter was about 10 years old, and she was asking all of these really fun questions, and she was kind of like reminding me that those were the questions that I had, and because we had this very close relationship, she didn't mind asking me these questions. Of course, I never asked these questions of my mother because it was a different relationship, but she was like, why do my armpits smell? Like, when are my breasts gonna grow? Like, why are these things happening? When's my period gonna come? And so I started to write the story from based on that kind of inquisitive nature that we all have at that time, and that we because of puritanical beliefs, because of religions, because of society, we're not really kind of encouraged or to explore or really can't even say out loud. So I thought it would be really interesting to provide a story for my daughter that would answer those questions in a fun way. But also, as I researched, I discovered that the conversation around menstruation had not really happened in the middle grade fictional space at all since Judy Blume's Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret. I mean, there are tons and tons of books about your period and getting your period and like the very kind of non-fictional elements of menstruation. But when it came to fiction, it was like almost absent. There are very few moments where we see it in the middle grade space. So it was a shock. It was certainly the first Latina story to deal with menstruation, and that was a big shock as well. But and then also it was, similarly to Lexie's, this was the first time that we saw a gender fluid character in Latinx literature as well. And I'm not non-binary, not gender expansive in any way, but when I was a child, my gender expression was very male, and they called me tomboy back in the 70s and 80s, right? That's what the term was. But because culture being what it was, it kind of silenced that. And so one of the characters is this gender fluid character who is discovering and blossoming on their own. So it was all kind of this part of me coming out, young me coming out, and then also, in service to my daughter and other menstruators who needed to just talk about it.
Right. Well, you do so much more than talk about it, though, because it's such a celebration,
Yes.
and which is what, it's such a beautiful celebration of menstruation that, anyway. Lexie, how about you? You operate in a lot of different spaces, so what was the drive for you to write this middle grade novel?
The first draft was a gift for someone who was a big crush at the time. They told me to write a children's book, and I said, okay. I'll do whatever positive thing you're encouraging me to do. And so I wrote the first draft for them in one sitting in a minivan. And then I became obsessed with the characters and continued with it. I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I'm pretty open about it at this point. And largely because of that, like Rowan, I didn't really have a relationship with my voice growing up. I associated my voice with trouble, and like Rowan, I associated writing anything down as trouble. So I did not have a period in my life before writing this particular draft where I was like, I'm going to be a novelist. I didn't think I had enough thoughts for that. I wasn't sure if I could sit with myself in that way. And in some ways, the process of writing this text, dealing with those themes, I was heavily driven through my own experience. A big part of my coming out process was receiving the assumption that I'm trans because I was abused as a child, and so I very much let Rowan guide that narrative that is based off of my own truth, which is that it's usually the opposite. Trans youth are more vulnerable to all forms of abuse, both systemic but also within the home. And I'm going to offer a resource, but it was also a gift to myself after it being a gift to another person.
Well, and now it's a gift. It's really such a beautiful book and a gift
to
the world. So I'm just going to briefly sort of tell my story. I was a teacher. I don't teach anymore, but I was a middle school teacher for a lot of years. And many years ago, probably 12 or 13 years ago, I heard very third hand about an incident on a bus with a middle school girl whose two male friends, sort of sandwiched her between them, all fully dressed, not, that was it. That was the moment. And she responded as though she'd been sexually attacked. She went into her house and took a shower and threw her clothes out. And this was pre-Me Too, before the Me Too movement had sort of gotten very large and public. And I thought to myself, that's so many middle school girls' experiences. So many, girls at that age have this moment where they feel attacked, but nobody was talking about it. So I started writing That's What Friends Do. And when I first started writing it and was a little bit shopping it around looking for an agent, people told me that that you couldn't write that kind of book in middle grade. So I'm thrilled that we are here because we're, the world has changed and we can talk about this, and there's a lot out there now that's addressing abuse, that's addressing, body images, body imagery, feelings about your body. So that's all great news for the middle school world.
Yeah.
So I want to ask Lexie and Sonja. The protagonists in your novel are both in 5th grade, which is young for a middle grade novel. Why did you choose that age for your main character? And did you get any sort of pushback about that? Let me start with Sonja.
Yeah, I mean, again, it sort of felt like she came to me that way, right? Where she was this late elementary school character, and I had this sense of her life that way, including school. And I think that it, like I said, from the statistic, it makes sense that to have the book be aimed at that age. But yeah, I mean, I would say there's still some, it hasn't been totally overt after the publication process. Before, though, yes, it was pretty difficult to get it published, and I think there was definitely some concern about the it being a middle grade book in particular, that people expected to be YA. And it's interesting because in this particular book, it's actually after the abuse has happened, and it's really about her emotional journey. So I feel very strongly, of course, about pushing back on that, because I do feel like that's related to the taboo about the topic, and it's really conflates the actual crime with the survivor's story and the survivor's experiences. So, I mean, I think some of that, has to change, of course, over time, because when it's so instilled in culture, it doesn't go away immediately. But I do think it's important to have it be able to be talked about. And I don't find that that's true from children. It's really more from adults that
right.
they feel are concerned about the topic. But kids actually are pretty open to hearing about a lot of different things. And of course, you know, you can write things all kinds of different ways and for all kinds of different levels, just like with anything else. So, yeah. So, I mean, I would hope that, you know, in the future, it would be just like if you're reading about someone's experience, it'd be like reading about someone's experiences with cancer. Maybe a particular kid doesn't like, you know, very serious books or books that might be sad or something like that. But that'd be more about really reading preferences almost more than about the actual topic. That would be my hope.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I gave it to my 14-year-old nephew.
Okay.
And he read it and he came to me and he said, "This is really good." So,
Oh, that's great to hear.
so he had no problem reading about a sort of a younger character, and he was very, very moved by the story. Lexie, how about you? Why 5th grade? And did you get any pushback on that? And yeah.
The deepest reason is that was the age for me when that type of abuse escalated in my home, in my body. And I really believe a part of me has stopped at that age. I feel like a part of me will always be stuck at that age because of that. And most of the time I feel ashamed about that, but the process of writing this was a way to move that shame a little bit. But there are also other reasons why I wanted to do 5th grade. I think it's one of the most interesting ages there could be. Because for me, that was the age where I realized not everyone is my friend. It's also the age where imagination becomes punishable. And for me, imagination was such a huge tool for survival. To know that there can be another place and another way of experiencing the future, where once you hit age 11, 12, there's all this, oh, you still do that? Like, there's a race to grow up and to grow up fast, even if one is still a child. And I think that for me was when a lot of depression sat in, was because my biggest tool for survival was no longer assumed to be
acceptable.
Acceptable. Perfect word. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So those are the main reasons. And yes, there was a little bit of pushback. One of the biggest questions I've gotten upon the release is like, is this book age appropriate? And not just because of the sexual abuse, but also because the trans and queer elements of the text, which is very frustrating. I really believe that, especially as a survivor myself, like, as long as children are experiencing something, then it is child appropriate, because you can't expect someone to denormalize abuse if they can't even name the abuse.
Right. Wow. Okay. I'm going to ask Aida and Sonja. You both of your books, novels, are written in verse. Was that a conscious? Now, you've interestingly also both spoken here about that. What came to you was this voice, and you sort of started with the voice. Was it a conscious decision to continue writing in verse? And what does writing in verse allow you to do that writing in prose doesn't? Aida, why don't you?
Well, I'm a poet mostly. I do write prose, but I've written most of all of what I've written published has been in verse.
Okay.
And so I am in love with poetry and all of the tools that you're able to kind of harness and execute in a verse novel. And of course I love stories. So I'm a huge fan of this hybrid form, because you're able to use figurative language and imagery and, you know, the musicality of the words and, you know, white space and all of these kind of poetic techniques to communicate on not just like this is what happened, but this is what this feels like. You know, Billy Collins, this poet, famous poet, says that poetry is a history of the human heart, and so. And I believe that. I really believe that we're able to kind of access a very deep, emotional, personal realm when we use poetry to tell a story. And so I kind of really adore that. And when I was writing this particular story, it really lent itself so beautifully to this because it was so personal, right? Like, how do you tell about, like, you know, there's this one passage which has been the one that's kind of been censored the most. This book has been censored quite a bit because of this one poem, and it's very short, and it's My Flower, Mi Flor, and where she talks about her vulva. And this is the first time in middle grade literature that we see a young girl talk about her anatomy in that way. And that's taboo, right? Like, we can talk about our eyes or our hair or, you know, or our legs or toes or whatever, but your vulva but again, it was done through poetry because it was a metaphor. It was a flower. And her labia were, you know, petals, and her clitoris a happy button, right? So these are all just you know, it using metaphor really kind of allowed it to be middle grade. It allowed it to be appropriate and I don't know, acceptable.
Right.
But still censored, despite my best efforts. So
Shocking.
So, but it was the personal. It's the ability to access the personal for me.
Okay. And Sonja?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel I came at it a little differently because this was the first thing I'd written in free verse. And I do think that was partly related to the picture book, you know, being in the language. And so that's what gave me access to it. And then since then, things I've worked on, I've done some more things and worked on some things more in verse. And also I more feel like I can pull in some hybrid things into my prose, sometimes going into more of a verse section, for example. But yes, I think it's, for me, I would also use maybe the word immediacy, that there was something about, I was able to access the immediacy easier with verse and with all of the techniques. And I would say also, you know, it's not autobiographical, but having had my own experiences with PTSD, it allowed me, I think, to access sort of her disjointed thoughts, how that worked, and her dissociation from her body and things like that in ways that would have been, I think, a lot harder in prose. So I definitely feel like it had all these possibilities that were open to me and freed me up. So it really felt like free verse was the right word for it because it felt freeing.
I was struck that the verse form allowed you also to as Aida said, to use metaphor in some cases and to be oblique in some places, which would have been harder, I think, to do in prose. So let me follow that up with Sonja. You, well into the book, not in the beginning, but well into the book, you use the word molested. You do use that word. Can you talk a little bit about that choice, why you don't use it initially, and then why you did choose to include it?
Yeah, so in her perspective, I think that word isn't, well, first she's just struggling to understand what happened. So she's not really naming it at all, I would say, to start with. But because I'm so immersed in her perspective, yeah, I think it's something that more she comes to understand that term and name it that way and understand it that way as she goes along. So in my head, I'm conceptualizing sort of in the backstory that, you know, it's her therapy and things like that are starting to have that terminology be part of how she thinks about it. So I think that's really why. It's just because she, at the beginning, isn't really like calling that herself. So that's probably why I would say.
I loved her therapist. Her therapist was so great. Anyway, you wrote a great therapist.
Thank you.
Lexie, you never name it. You never call it molested or abused. You don't use that language. So I wanted to ask you why you didn't use that language.
Yeah, I love that question. Nobody's asked me that so directly, and I appreciate you asking. I would say two big reasons come to mind. One is it's important to me that this book was accessible to young people who might still be in those situations. And I feared that if I directly used the word abuse, rape, molestation, that they would have a gatekeeper and not allow them to receive the text. And so it's a subversion, in a way to allow it to enter those spaces. And honestly, the word trans also doesn't come up in, or LGBTQ, like any of that is in the text, only in my author note at the end, for those same reasons. And the second big reason is because, since it's based off my experience, I didn't realize anything was happening until about 10 years into it. And that is quite normal. Many survivors of childhood sexual abuse do not know or remember until adulthood, sometimes well into their adulthood. And so I didn't have the expectation for Rowan to ever have those words. And it also takes place in the late 90s, so the larger conversation is also completely different at that time, but also largely the same, because I would love to see more young voices in the Me Too movement, pre-college voices. It's I think for me at the time it was all smells, shapes, and colors. Rowan does have a slight arc of redetermining what he wants to be normal, and that is my my greatest hope for survivors of any age, is to re-navigate what is normal, what is inevitable. And so although he doesn't name his abuse, and he doesn't, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but even though he never names his abuse, it's a process of him figuring out what a future can look like. And that's hard. If there were a sequel, I'm not sure yet what form that would take. And if, so for context, the book is a series of letters attached to balloons. So if the book had ended on a different day, it might have been very different. And so that was an interesting decision too, when thinking about the entire arc related to sexual abuse, especially, is every day is a little bit different.
I have to say I loved the last letter. I won't say more than that, but I think that opens it up in a really beautiful way. So
thank you.
I hope there's a sequel. Okay, so we all debuted, I believe, in 2020. Yes. So this has been a rough year in terms of talking to middle schoolers about our books. But I did want to kind of ask you, how do you talk about this, about your book with middle schoolers? Because we are all talking about in our books issues that some adults don't want middle schoolers to talk about. So Aida, let me start with you.
How about I ask that question of you? I'm so curious to hear about your book, and you haven't had an opportunity. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
So, you know, I haven't been able to go into schools really with the book yet. But when I talk about it, when I have been able to talk about it with middle schoolers, I tend to be focusing on the craft of writing and not not this Me Too moment at the center, because I'm not an expert on the Me Too. You know, I'm not an expert. And I feel in some ways like, you know, sort of having the story there for students, for kids, and then talking about, you know, how you create a character is a way to like almost inoculate them, give them a chance to sort of think about this difficult or uncomfortable topic without sort of, directly bringing it up. You know, I've had groups, like book groups, where they've all read it, and so they do want to talk about, you know, the relationship between Sammy and David, and you know, why it happens, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know if that's much of an answer.
Right. No. I mean, it's difficult. I think you just kind of highlight how much of a risk we all take when we are writing on the edge in this way, when we are writing controversial stories, especially in the educational space. You know, these are. I'll share one anecdote. I was at a bilingual educators conference, and we were doing these roundtables where the authors stay at a table, and then the educators moved from table to table, and they met the different debut authors, and we were pitching our books to them. And the first crop of people, after I did my pitch, they said, well, it sounds very lovely, but just the fact that there's a gender fluid character would like make my school board just shut it down. And I was like, really? And so I asked the rest of them, like, could you teach this in your classroom? And they said, you know, we'd have to send a letter home. We'd have to separate the boys and the girls because menstruation isn't for everybody. And then the other thing they said was that teachers were too busy with their workloads to take on a controversial book. And so, yeah. And it was, and I was like very grateful for their candor. I mean, like as what it is. But after the roundtable, when it came time to sell books, my line was really long. All of the educators were buying the book for that one child that they knew. That they knew that there was one child in their community or their family or whatever that they knew needed this book. And so I just want to kind of like encourage all of us that, like, even though these might not be taught in the educational setting, you know, we are providing a voice for children who really need to be seen and to kind of learn about these issues and these feelings that happen in the middle grade space. So anyway, I tip my hat to all of you for doing what you're doing.
Sonja, how about you? Have you had a chance to talk to kids? Have you pitched this book to schools? Or
so I was supposed to have some school visits. You know, mine came out right around the time everything shut down. And I'm still hoping maybe this fall it can happen, but I don't know. My experience also has been that schools are just so overwhelmed now with everything that it's been hard even to bring anyone back at all. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I would still like to. And I had offered a couple different possibilities to schools. One would be if they wanted to do something more directly about sexual abuse, but I felt like that should also be me with someone else also, because, you know, I wouldn't be handling other aspects of it. But what people chose, which I also like, is I have another talk that's more about empathy. So it talks a lot about the best friend and how she misunderstands what's happening. Her friend's changing it, you know, she just assumes it's about the friendship, and, you know, a lot of different things like that. And so trying to approach, because I do believe this about all books as well, is that, you know, the personal and the universal, whole thing, like that the personal is the universal, is that I think that I wanted also kids going through other kinds of difficult circumstances to also take hope from it. And so in that way, it's a little sideways on sexual abuse as a topic, but that it's one of many very difficult circumstances that someone could be going through, and sort of taking that approach of looking at empathy and realistic hope and all of that from that perspective too. Yeah.
Lexie, how about you?
I very much related to the story shared from the Bilingual conference. A lot of a lot of people saying that, you know, school wouldn't necessarily do it because it both deals with trans issues and childhood sexual abuse, and it's, to be honest with you, it's hard not to take it personally, as those are both a part of my identities.
Right.
But definitely a lot of people connecting on getting copies for that one person. And I also want to say that it's never just one person. It just isn't. And so I hope that narrative can expand for educators and for, I guess, anyone listening to this. Is that it's never just one person.
Right.
You know, when you think of it from a statistical standpoint. But also we don't live in a world where being a survivor is a binary. It's not that there's only survivors and perpetrators in this world, but there are people who mean other things, people who are complicit, people who are other family members, people who honestly hold various levels of responsibility for both culture and actions. And so I really am tired of like the idea that the work and the processing all has to be on the survivor or a professional. It needs to be a community move. And so I hope for a future where people who are gatekeepers can think beyond who's holding these responsibilities.
So that's actually a beautiful segue into what I think will be our last question, which is that all of these books, all of our books, have upstanders in them. Have the people who support the main character, who hear the main character. In my novel, it's actually a new friend. Sammy makes a new friend, and she's finally able to tell this new friend what's going on, and her friend hears her. So it's their friendship is the thing that sort of their building friendship is the thing that sort of protects her or gives her something else to think about. But it's also the friendship. And then this girls' softball team that she sort of almost accidentally joins becomes a protective force for her. Aida, in your story, it's the families who are actually protective, and sort of the community. The pushback and the misunderstanding comes from sort of the larger community. Can you talk a little about that? And then I just want to hear from Sonja and Lexie about the Upstanders in their books.
Sure. You know, I wrote that character rooted in Mexica tradition, a tradition where gender fluidity or gender expansiveness was not a binary. It was accepted, and in fact was viewed with through a sacred lens. And so this is all information and cultural practices that were decimated during colonization. And so, you know, I wanted to show the current Latinx community another way, for them to remember what it is and how we viewed before colonization trans folks, gender expansive folks, queer folks. So right, and so I wanted that to be the reality for this character. So it was really important for me to include progressive parents who were loving and patient, as to model for our community. You know, that is, in Latinx communities are very homophobic and transphobic and machista. And I wanted to kind of really rewrite that narrative and have people remember it. And so it was critical that the community be loving, to have that reflected in children who might see themselves that way, and know that their own sacredness and their own beauty lies within. So that was very, very much intentional.
It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. Sonja, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in particular of Tori's teacher, who is really the one who instigates that it's going to, go to the police, and it's not directly shown, but his influence on the mom is part of how that happens. And the mom actually doesn't believe her at first. She thinks that she's misunderstanding what happened, though she does, fairly quickly in the story. So yeah, I think of the teacher, and I think, yeah, I mean, it was a lot about the thing that we say, right, which is to keep telling people and keep trying. I very much wanted the book to be realistic, that maybe that doesn't happen immediately, but my hope is that, if you can take that long-term perspective, and hope that that's the best thing possible. If I can give kids that sense that that's possible, to have this longer-term hope that, if something doesn't immediately get better, that it can get better longer term, I think is a lot of the goal there. So to keep trying, but that unfortunately, the reality is that sometimes it doesn't actually work the first time, or that the help doesn't happen the first time, and adults often fail kids. So kind of both of those together, I'm hoping can provide, like I said, I think of it as my realistic hope, my realistic long-term hope that hopefully helps kids persist and tell other people and keep trying to get help.
I also loved I appreciated the character of the grandmother, who is this adult who doesn't want to hear that, I liked that you represented you really represented the world as it is. And Lexie, how about you? It's Mr. B, right? Mr. B? I love it.
I would say he's a part of it. I would say that the biggest advocate for Rowan is ultimately himself.
Oh, okay.
I think that there are people who remind him of his own power. I think, maybe it's himself, but I also think the reader, because as I mentioned before, each chapter is a letter that's attached to a balloon. And so the book itself, I think of it as a series of bound letters. And I was very intentional about that, because I want the reader to feel responsible for Rowan. I want the reader to humanize Rowan. some of the most interesting and in some ways meaningful feedback I've gotten is that a lot of readers have said they want to hug Rowan. And I think that's amazing because that means that there is a relationship there. And he continues writing because he believes that at first, maybe someone will find his letter. Maybe he'll make a new friend. Maybe something will change for him. But, you know, in the end, it's less about making a new friend and it's more about being witnessed. And I think any reader who makes it through his letters did what he needed most, and that is to witness him in the quiet moments that nobody else saw.
Beautiful. I do love Mr. B and Sophie, who also support him. So I think that's going to wrap it up for our panel. This has been an amazing panel. I'm so glad that we got to come together and talk. And I hope that lots of people will see it. So
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.